The Star Citizen flight experience is one of the most overlooked yet incredible aspects of the game. I say overlooked because when it comes to space simulation games, there are a large number of people playing interested in different parts of the game, and Star Citizen offers so much more than just flight. The flight experience can be easily overlooked for this reason. It's a good thing then that it is by far my favorite part of the game, and so in this video it is my goal to show you exactly why the Star Citizen flight experience is beyond anything you've seen before, and why CIG is sitting on a golden nugget and don't even see it. Before we deep dive directly into the juicy details surrounding flight modes and the like, let's take a step back and talk about all of the pieces that make up this wonderful puzzle. Star Citizen, of course, offers much more than simple spaceflight in a zero-G vacuum environment where all ships handle the same. Instead, ships have incredible character where one ship handles completely different from the next. On top of that, it works to accurately model aerodynamic resistance, where ships handle differently yet again when introduced to planets with a varying density and atmosphere, as well as an exaggerated effect in gas clouds, such as the space stations and xenothreat events located around Stanton's Lagrange points. Let's take a few minutes to go over all of the intricates, break down the aspects of flight, and then look at how different ship control systems affect what we do, how we do it, and how you might be missing out on the best aspects of flight in Star Citizen. Spaceflight, zero-G in a vacuum, where your ship will accurately follow Newton's first law and float off in whatever direction you sent it. Ships are incredibly drifty in a vacuum, and this is where careful thruster tuning becomes really important for CIG, as they make sure that ships have a believable amount of strength in any given direction. For example, your main thrusters are strongest, and so if you're traveling from point to point or are approaching a space station, for example, the best thing you can do is flip and burn to slow down, just like real space travel. Ships in Star Citizen, of course, though, have thrusters pointing in every direction, meaning that you could use your retro thrusters instead, which are often the next strongest on a ship. The brakes, if you will. Beyond the mains and retros, Star Citizen also offers each ship with thrusters that allow strafing left, right, up and down to give you the best control possible with minimal drift. This is essential, of course, for a modern space game with combat and the like. And like I mentioned, balancing these is incredibly difficult, and CIG is definitely approaching this in a good way as they find a balance between realism and their so-called rule of cool. Right now, Strafe Up is magically boosted as confirmed by Yogi from the Vehicle Experience team. And this means that they are stronger than they should, simply to avoid too much drift in combat and give you a nicer experience in a zero-G environment where drift is at its greatest. Now, this does lead to some strange behaviors where, for example, braking with the thrustums on the bottom of the ship is more efficient than using your retros. And this is counterintuitive and, plainly put, quite silly. We should of course be using either the mains or the retros to slow down, and the maneuvering thrusters left, right, up and down should be weaker than the both. Now, they have confirmed already that this isn't their final take on this, as they aim to do this correctly in the future. They've confirmed this in one of the Inside Star Citizen videos, and I'm confident they'll get it right. I've personally got all sorts of ideas for what this means and suggestions, but I'll leave those for slightly later into the video. Before we move on, let's compare two completely different ships. Here's a tiny snub fighter, Kruger's P-72 Archimedes. You will not find a ship that flies more nimble and precise in a vacuum. Its thrusters are incredibly strong, and it weighs absolutely nothing, keeping drift to an absolute minimum and giving you a run for your money in terms of G-loading. With the updated G-locking sensitivities in-game since 3.16, I feel we've struck the perfect balance between how tightly a ship can turn and how your body is often the limiting factor in terms of turning even tighter. Simply because you would over-G and black out before reaching the limits of the ship you're flying. This is really cool. On the other side of the spectrum, take something like this Hercules. It is incredibly large and heavy, and as a result flies as you would expect, very sluggish and accurately reflecting the size and weight. It is so immersive. You'll still get the Herc over 1000 meters per second. It's got the thrusters to go that fast, but you better be prepared to take a long time to turn around and slow down. As mentioned, Star Citizen offers an incredible, yet work-in-progress flight model for atmospheric aerodynamic flight, and this changes everything. Now not only do you have to think about weight and thruster strength, you're also thinking about a ship's aerodynamic profile, how that affects the natural stability of the ship, how it introduces drag, how fast you can accelerate through the air, how this affects fuel consumption, and in the future, its control surfaces, and how these then affect a ship's character yet again in terms of turn rates and lift generation. Ships with big wings or big control surfaces are obviously going to do better in aero than ships that don't have wings. Before we look at some ships, first let's take a look at two planets, two very different planets. This is Daymar. It's a moon that orbits Crusader and has a relatively thin atmosphere of around 0.5 ATMs, half of Earth. Gravity on Daymar is sitting at a comfortable 0.35 Gs. And these factors then affect your ship. It's easier to push through the atmo, of course, because it's thinner. You're getting aerodynamic loading, but by a smaller factor than what you'd experience on a planet with a denser atmosphere, like Microtech. On Daymar, you will fly over 1000 meters per second in the right ship because there isn't enough aerodynamic drag. While on a planet like Microtech, where you experience Earth-like pressures, a ship will fly and turn much slower as the aerodynamic pressures affect your ship so much more. On the other side of the spectrum, we can take a look at a Lagrange point. I mentioned these earlier. In reality, the gas density of these clouds would be so thin that it would have absolutely no effect, but this is where CIG has taken some liberties in the name of their rule of cool to make things fun. And this means that where gas clouds are much denser visually, they also offer aerodynamic pressures in unison. This is why a spaceship will slow down to a stop quicker, and why, take a P-72 for example, bumps around when trying to yaw in space. It meets aerodynamic resistances that are denser in some parts than they are in others, depending on what part of the cloud you're flying through. A little unrealistic in terms of density maybe, but super cool. Balancing the ships to behave accurately in all of these different environments then is an art in itself, and what gives these ships in Star Citizen so much character. This is again one of those things CIG is doing wonderfully, and why I'm having so much fun with Star Citizen. I can take any ship, go to any place, and have a unique experience depending on what ship I'm in and what the aerodynamic pressures are. It is so much fun just to fly around. So let's take a look at some more ships. We'll start with this chunky boy, the Cutlass. There's not much here that spells aerodynamic efficiency, and so you can forget about lift. The only lift on a Cutlass is produced by itself, with the use of VTOL. VTOL standing for vertical takeoff and landing. A Cutlass will be able to lift off and hover and rotate its VTOL thrusters for forward flight. Now, there's some work needed here in terms of how VTOL operates, and I've done a video on this already, too actually, that I suggest you check out. In essence, I suggested that the VTOL thrusters should gimbal based on demand and rotate into whatever position needed instead of an on-off behavior. But there's lots of issues at the moment with VTOL where they're not actually necessary. We'll go into that in a second. First, let's take a look at a few ships that are much more focused on atmospheric flight. The M50, the Razor, the P-52 Merlin, and the P-72 Archimedes. These ships make use of control surfaces. That means the flaps on the wings that allow it to rotate and change its pitch. Any airplane has these. They'll adjust the angle of attack for climbing or descent. CIG intends to make accurate use of these, but for now, these don't function. Yet ships have to fly accurately in atmo, so how do they do this right now? Essentially, all ships currently use their maneuvering thrusters, MAVs, to adjust pitch, roll, and yaw. Some ships have stronger MAVs than others, so can do that better or worse. CIG is currently boosting these numbers to make up for the lack of control surfaces then, probably using different ships for different tests as well. You can really feel the difference between ships and how they are approaching every ship in a slightly different way. This means that some ships can adjust better than others, and some are simply broken. It's important that we remember this when we experience better or worse mechanics between ships. Everything's a test, this is alpha, and we need to give feedback in terms of what we like, what we see, and what we experience, and then CIG can use our feedback to optimize the experience and make sure they get it right. Everything spells though that they are approaching this with the right idea in mind. For example, a Razor can roll faster than an M50, simply because it has fewer wing. In real life too, the size of the wings of an airplane, among other factors, determine its roll rate. The larger the wings, the higher the loading, and thus the slower the turn rates. This is again also the case in Star Citizen. And the M50 currently is deemed broken by many, because it pitches aggressively when you let the ship get out of hand in atmospheric flight. In reality though, it is most probably closer to the final model for when control surfaces come into play than any other ship. The reason being is that the M50 probably suffers from a natural unstable aerodynamic flight profile, just like for example a real-life F-16 where there are a ton of systems constantly making sure that the ship stays on path, on vector, and stable. And the M50 then has MAVs that currently aren't strong enough to stabilize its pitch while it is trying to rely on non-operable control surfaces. They just don't work yet, and so the ship gets out of control. And CIG has thus mentioned that they will be looking to offer some temporary fixes, probably stronger MAVs or something like that, to help stabilize until control surfaces come into play. We might even see this as soon as 3.17, although I'm not sure by the time you're watching this if 3.17 has come out and or whether they have managed to get it in. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the P-52, the Merlin, which appears to have a very stable aerodynamic profile. In combination with MAVs strong enough to stabilize the ship at extreme angles of attack, it doesn't buck like crazy like an M50. The P-52 simply doesn't drift and cuts through the air like butter as if it were flying on rails. The interesting fact about the P-52 is that it allows you to clearly see where CIG is taking the aerodynamic flight model. All you have to do is shut off the engines. When you shut off the engines, the IFCS can no longer use your MAVs, and so the ship is basically soaring through the air as it would naturally. And this is where we can see that the P-52 in its natural state has lift. With sufficient airspeed, the ship will first pitch up and gain altitude, naturally through the means of lift, before it bleeds off airspeed, stalls, and pitches down again. It's a conversion from speed to altitude back to speed. Now, people have said Star Citizen doesn't have lift accurately modeled across different surfaces of the ship, but use this as an example at least, that CIG is doing some things to generate drag and lift across the entire body of the ship, and this is awesome. I'm so excited for where this will take us in the future. If you disable all thrusters on a P-52 and only use its main thrusters, you can even take off of the ground like an aeroplane. The ship has a natural stable platform, and if it has just that little bit of pitch up angle of attack, it'll take off. When comparing the P-52 to its younger sister, the P-72, which looks identical, almost, you'll end up confused and wondering why the hell it flies so different in atmo. Where the P-72 has much stronger thrusters, for some reason it simply refuses to pitch if you aren't boosting, where in reality it should have more power to cut through the air than the weaker P-52. And this shows that they're really doing something different between these two ships. They look almost identical, yet behave very different in atmo. This is where I think CIG is experimenting with how they can approach a ship, how they work with the aerodynamics, and how control surfaces might influence a ship's behavior. It almost feels like on the P-52 they're doing some fake magic stuff to make it feel like it has control surfaces, where on the P-72 they haven't done this and it's flying as if you don't have control surfaces and MAVs only. Very interesting. Now, let's take a look at something like the Razor, which is an entirely different beast yet again. The Razor loves to drift, and this is incredibly fun, yet completely opposite from the P52 for example. Just look at how the Razor is drifting through these turns at the Snake Pit. Where one might say that the P52 handles more like an aeroplane that doesn't really drift, the Razor on the other side of the spectrum offers equal amounts of fun and, again, demonstrates how CIG experiments with different models. I'm not sure where they'll take this in the future, but I'm somehow hoping, where I love both sides of this coin if you will, that we'll get to see both working differently on different ships as we do see right now. Before we move away from the subject, I'd like to offer a sort of suggestion to the development of the flight model in Star Citizen. I hope CIG is listening. As mentioned before, VTOL should be a crucial factor in carrying heavy ships. No VTOL, no carry. Simply because a ship would be too heavy for the normal maneuvering thrusters. Now, you might say that, unladen, a ship might not need as much of its VTOL, and I totally get that. Cargo should be taken into consideration when you're talking about VTOL, but VTOL should be necessary on a heavy ship. Regular maneuvering thrusters shouldn't be enough to constantly carry a ship, and this also carries over to ships that don't have VTOL. Right now, ships will hover in whatever orientation when flying within the gravity of an Earth-like planet. This is odd, and an unfortunate byproduct of the current strength of the maneuvering thrusters. The concern here is, of course, that if you reduce the strength of these maneuvering thrusters to make it so that it can't carry the ship, ships become more sluggish in space, and that's not really what you want either. In Atmo, you might be able to fix this with a little bit more of a stable drag lift platform, but in space, you're gonna be super sluggish. The balancing act here is extremely challenging, but where Yogi has mentioned in the IEC already that they are looking to offer a better final solution, I can only imagine they will do this by adding additional dynamics to the maneuvering thrusters. Imagine, for example, and this is part of my solution, that MAVs still carry the same strength, but only for limited amounts of time. Either they overheat and burn out, or consume so much fuel that you'll run empty very quickly, maybe a combination of the two. So take a Carrack or the Hercules, it'll carry itself on the MAVs, but for a very short time, so you better swap over to your bigger VTOL engines. In essence, you still want MAVs to provide small bursts of strong power, but still take away their capacity to output this extreme power indefinitely. In space, this would mean that you can still turn tightly, albeit for a shorter amount of time, and in stronger gravity environments with a dense atmosphere, this would mean relying on either VTOL for ships without wings or aerodynamic lift for ships with wings. And yes, this might mean that winged ships would prefer approaching a landing with a bit of forward momentum for additional carrying capacity or lift, while also being able to hover at higher heat or fuel consumption where a hover or vertical landing is required. Now, in terms of some of this Atmo flight, you might be thinking to yourself that you haven't really felt a lot of this, or that ships feel very samey in completely different places. One big reason why all of this beauty is so often missed by Star Citizen pilots is that they are flying coupled. In my opinion, Star Citizen's coupled mode is far from ideal, in need of a lot of work. It takes away a lot of the feel and doesn't necessarily help a pilot control their ship more accurately. The opposite, in fact. Let's talk about the 3 flight systems that Star Citizen offers. Yes, I said 3. And this is where CIG offers a golden nugget and don't even know it. We'll start with coupled. The 2 things that coupled mode does well are offering a solution for keyboard and mouse pilots that need help stopping their ship from floating away and out of control. It slows down your ship to a halt when you aren't providing input, and this can of course help stabilize your ship. Additionally, it keeps your ship's vector in line with your crosshair by automatically making the necessary adjustments using the maneuvering thrusters, and this can help optimize your ship in a straight line if needed as well. I use this in combination with cruise control, for example, when I want to take my hand off the stick. It does mean though that you lose a lot of the feel for your ship. Even in space, it feels like you're an airplane. The awful thing coupled mode does is change your throttle behavior so that you cannot gently provide thrust. Just look at this, it's so sensitive. When using a HOTAS or dual stick setup, inputting let's say 10% of your thrust power now provides 100% full power immediately in the given direction until 10% of the maximum speed is achieved. Essentially, your thrust inputs on your stick or your HOTAS throttle now turn into a device to set a target speed, which coupled mode will try to achieve as fast as possible. Move your stick to 10%, the ship's gonna go to 10% speed as fast as it can. No gentle calm nudges, no, full power until speed achieved. Very simple, very inaccurate. And this is probably the reason you headbutt stuff when flying in close proximity. It doesn't feel gentle and doesn't make you feel much more in control. Now, two ways to avoid this are by either enabling the thrust limiter, which gentles your maximum input, or alternatively using the even more so annoyingly proximity assist found only in the menu options, which also gentles your maximum inputs when you're close to stuff, but at the risk of impacting when you least expect it. For example, when flying close to the ground at speed. Proximity assist would still turn on and you'll end up sinking and hitting the ground and dying, most probably. Both of these systems just add more complexity on top of an already difficult system, so let's not focus on it too much. Alright, so as an alternative, we go decoupled instead. That is obviously where I spend 99% of my time. If you're a joystick pilot, you'll immediately notice that thrust you input is accurately reflected. Input 10% and your thrusters will fire at 10% of their maximum thrust. Gentle and controllable. In space, any relative momentum you have, you keep until you add thrust again to adjust your ship's vector. Newton's first law, check. In Atmo, this will allow you the best feel of what your ship is doing in terms of aerodynamics. If you don't input anything, you fall or sink, and if you input strafe up, you'll increase lift and affect how the ship might pitch through the air. If you input strafe left or right, the ship will have a tendency to yaw and buck a little bit as it experiences aerodynamic loads on the side of the ship. The effect of this, of course, as you can expect from Star Citizen, depends on what you're flying. Decoupled mode in many ways gives more manual control of your ship, and I would wholeheartedly recommend any joystick pilot to fly decoupled, to get the most accurate and immersive experience. There is an issue, of course, that affects keyboard and mouse pilots primarily, but also joystick pilots that use a HOTAS with a throttle setup. Sometimes you want your ship to float like it would in space, maintain whatever momentum you have, or simply you want decoupled mode, but you also want to maintain altitude against gravity without having to work for it, constantly tapping your button or doing whatever it takes to not fall down to the ground. Flying decoupled, a keyboard pilot would have to tap 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 tap, while a joystick pilot would have to hold a certain input to stay afloat or keep drifting. Dual stick, this is easier. I use my pinky lever on the Virpil. HOTAS pilot might struggle to find an axis to bind to strafe up. This is where a third flight mode comes into play. This is Star Citizen's golden nugget. There is an entirely additional flight mode available that combines in many ways the best of both systems. You keep the manual control of the decoupled where your thruster reacts the way you expect, but you don't fall down to the ground in atmosphere. I want to start off with this clip from the Cutlass Steel. Beyond how epic it looks, pay attention to how the ship is moving. It is strafing at a constant rate while maintaining altitude perfectly. In coupled mode, this would be next to impossible. Things would look very jerky. In decoupled mode, this would require very precise input to maintain a constant strafe forward, sideways, and especially up to maintain altitude. This can be a little tricky. Now here's the trick. Lower your gear. Now you enter yet another flight mode, which for now is only available when your gear is lowered. Essentially, it mimics decoupled flight in 0G, meaning that it focuses on maintaining whatever vector you have set, even on a planet with gravity. It stops you from sinking unless you want it to, without any input, and without the jerky thruster behavior from coupled mode. Float mode, as I've come to name it, but really it's gear down mode, it will automatically hover for you, holding you up and away from gravity. Nudge strafe down for a moment and you'll start moving down at whatever rate you set, and it'll keep doing that until you add strafe up again to cancel the motion. And this is very gentle and controllable even for a keyboard mouse pilot. Keyboard mouse pilots have of course already experienced this while the landing gear was down and they were landing. Basically, it allows anyone to fly with the correct gentle thruster input method like you would experience in decoupled mode without the sink from gravity. The aerodynamics as well will still slow you down over time because of the aerodynamic drag. Now, I wouldn't want to use this new float mode all the time, because if I was flying a helicopter, I would want to do all of that manual stuff myself, and the same is true for Star Citizen with my dual stick setup. I want to do everything myself. But I would suggest that this float mode needs to become an additional toggle to give pilots as much choice as possible. I would suggest that the VTOL button is a perfect system to use for this, as the VTOL button, while functional on all ships, currently has no effect when used on a ship without VTOL capabilities. The light comes on in the cockpit, but it doesn't do anything. If this float mode would become, let's call it a VTOL mode, it would fit the role perfectly. You could fly coupled, decoupled, or VTOL float mode. An additional suggestion would be to remove this feature from the landing gear, since many decoupled pilots would really like to use gravity to land, like you would a helicopter, reducing its collective, instead of this float mode requiring strafe down input for your ship to start moving down toward the ground. Decoupled pilots currently experience a jerky behavior because they're holding vert up, strafe up to not fall down to the ground. But then when they lower their landing gear, they suddenly get jerked up because this new float mode takes over, and that little bit of strafe up that you were holding is now added to the already stable platform, and you start going up. So you have to very quickly go from strafe up to strafe down to make sure that you keep falling. It's very awkward, very jerky, and again, a decoupled pilot, when he lowers his gear, he wants to come in and just gently reduce the amount of strafe up he's giving, like you would in a helicopter, by lowering the collective and setting it down gently. It would be amazing if we could manually decide when or when not to use the VTOL float mode. For people that always want VTOL float mode with the gear down, there could be an option to tie the two together or simply bind both modes to the same key. Options, options, options. I say this all the time. There are a lot of situations where this float mode would be extremely beneficial, and I hope CIG will realize the golden nugget they're sitting on. Star Citizen flight mechanics, Star Citizen flight systems are in-depth, incredible, and so much fun. Now go out there and have a good time, pilot.